Hi, this is a video to show off some stuff I've been working on. I call it the Better Lit shader. And essentially what it is it's a replacement for Unity's standard or lit shaders in the render pipelines that adds a bunch of cool new features and allows you to use sort of high definition render pipeline features on URP or on standard, sort of unifying the workflow between all three. The shader is compatible across all three pipelines and has all the same parameters and stuff. So if you're moving from one to the other, anything using the shader will just work. I thought that there was a sort of gap because the old standard shader is pretty bad in a number of ways and doesn't have a lot of features. The lit shader for URP has a lot in common with that shader. And then the HDRP shader is a lot better, but it's only available on HDRP. And there were still some things that I wanted to add to that and extend it to have things that people need for sort of standard world texturing. So I'll show off some of the demo examples. I just have some spheres in here with some examples like triplanar texturing. It fully integrates with weather systems like Enviro and WeatherMaker, and if you need to drive global snow in your scene, it's very easy to do stuff like that, or wetness, puddles, stuff like that. This is an example of using multiple texture layers, which is you can have up to 4 layers of texture that you can blend using procedurals like angle and height field filters. You can blend with noise, or you can actually paint the blends if you want. This is an example of a height blended texture. Basically, those layers can blend together in different ways. You can alpha blend them, you can height blend them, or you can multiply them like a detail texture is. And then this example of tessellation. Right now I'm running in URP, but this works on any of the 3 pipelines in 2019 or 2020. And it's a detail texturing example, some double-sided. Again, you get full control over things like how you want to light the back faces. This is an example of procedural puddle placement with raindrops. The raindrops are really cranked high to be able to easily see them. You probably want to make them not so obvious in an actual game, but it gives you an example. And these are all placed procedurally, so you can see as I move this around, I'm placing them based on noise and world space. And I can adjust all the parameters of that. It has angle filters and things like that, so they won't appear on the sides of buildings and stuff like that. And then this is a procedural damage shader. Basically, again, this is all the same shader that you're looking at. It's just you have one shader, you turn options on and off for all these things. And this is using 2 layers of texture, and it's using a noise function, much like the puddles were, to basically have the damage in the object. And you can see as I move this around, it will adjust accordingly. And you can change those noise parameters and stuff. So the cool advantage of stuff like this is with these types of techniques, you can place a rock in the scene 20 times and you'll get a different result every time because the noise will be different in that location. I spelled procedural wrong up here. I have to fix that. Must have been typing too fast. Anyway, so a lot of cool techniques in these shaders, lots of stuff you can do. And the nice thing about having this done this way is that it's unified, right? So if you turn on these weathering effects and things, wetness, puddles, whatever, then if you just replace all your shaders with this one, then hey, everything has it. And you can drive all this stuff however you want. Let's see. Let's look at some of how this stuff is set up. So here's my procedural wall here. And this is actually, let me just make this a little bigger. So you can see here we have opacity if you want to make this alpha. We have our color mode if you want to do double-sided, and when you change this to some other option, it will give you options about the back face lighting and stuff. You have your workflow whether you want metallic or specular workflow. And then this one here is pretty important, is texture packing. So if you're familiar with like the standard shader in the built-in pipeline, and you wanted to have a height map, a diffuse map, normal map, you'd have an occlusion map, and maybe an emissive map, etc., etc. Well, that's really wasteful because a lot of those are only grayscale images, and so you end up with like 5 or 6 textures for your object, which is a bunch of memory, but it also means a bunch of sampling. So the main normal, I call it packing mode here, is exactly like HDRP. And so it has an albedo, a normal, and a mask map, which has smoothness, metallic, a detail textures mask, and then the ambient occlusion in it. I also have another packing mode called fastest packing mode. And when you do this, then you only need 2 textures. You don't get a metallic texture, but you do get the ability to have the rest of your components all in 2 texture maps. So that's less memory and less samples for the shader to do, so it runs faster. On the main layer here, we also have like whether I want to be in triplanar or use UVs. You can say in world or local space. And then when you're in UV mode, you can actually, if I switch it real quick, you can see here that it will let you project from different angles or use UV ones or 2. Yeah, so you can set this up however you want. Normal mode lets you choose from standard normal textures like you've used for ages. You can generate from the height map. The height map is stored in the diffuse alpha channel, and it's not a great technique for up close, but if you have plenty of texture resolution, because again you don't need the normal map, and you're on like a low-end phone and this stuff is in the background, you can actually just have 1 texture instead of 2 and generate all the normals procedurally. And for that kind of stuff, it works pretty surprisingly well. If you get too close to it, it doesn't look great though. And then I have an option for the surface gradient framework. The surface gradient framework is a new system for normal maps that Unity has released. It can make a difference when you're blending lots of normal maps together in like layers. So it's a little more expensive, not much, but it's more correct normals. Now, in a lot of cases, I don't really notice a difference in practice, but there are cases where you can see a difference from it. So that's something worth considering. Then any noise function you have can be in world space, local space, or UV space. So I'm in world space right now, so you'll notice that if I move this forward or backwards, it's changing that noise. If I was in UV space, and it would always be the same no matter where this object was in the world, right? And in local space, it would still be a 3D noise instead of a 2D noise, a little more expensive, but it would stick with the object. It wouldn't change, right? Now, if you scale the object, it would, something like that. You can turn on flat shading. I don't have an example and scene for that, but basically that's like I want it to look like I can see the polygons. And that's, here, we'll just do it on this guy here. So this is our, this guy, all, and we want the detail texture. So we can turn on flat shading. And this is an extremely high poly ball, so I don't know if, yeah, you can see it a little bit there, because it's very high poly, but it'll flat shade the object versus smooth shading. So yeah, that's a nice little bonus. So your main layer here, so your main texture layer, you're going to recognize this. This is going to look like most of the materials you've seen. You've got albedo. You've got options for parallax if you want to do parallax mapping. Normal, mask map, emission map, and then you have, much like an HDRP, you have the remapping of smoothness, metallic, and occlusion if you want to change the range. There's also stochastic texturing. Stochastic texturing is great because it completely clears out any type of tiling. So if I was to tile this a bunch, you'll see this pattern right here. If you turn on stochastic, this pattern just totally gets broken up. And it's a little hard to see because I'm not on a great texture for it. But it just totally fixes tiling. And you can do that individually on each layer of the texture layers, and you only pay the cost for the layer you do it on. So I'm going to set these UVs back to something more reasonable. Stochastic has a scale and contrast. So detail texturing, if we were to turn that on, this looks very much like the HDRP. In fact, it's exactly the same as the HDRP detail texture. Essentially what they do is they pack a luminosity, a normal, and a smoothness value into one texture and then blend it with your object, and then you can control various strengths and tiling. You can also change whether this is UV'd or triplanar, or projected on an axis or whatever you want. Again, it's all independent, and you can also say it's stochastically sampled. So the cool thing about this is if you were doing a rock, you might have like a really nice rock with a casted normal from the high poly model that looks really great, but then you get close up and you're like, it kind of looks crappy. Well, you can use a detail texture, and then you can tile that a whole bunch of times to give it some like low level texture, right? And then you can triplanar that so it doesn't use the original UV mapping and doesn't show any seams or anything if you wanted to. And you could also stochastic that, and then it would break up any tiling in that highly tiled texture. You can also do the same thing with another texture layer. The texture layer has a bunch of different modes. You can use a multiply mode, and then you have like full on color and everything, and you can do detail texturing that way. It's a little more expensive, but it is an option, and lets you go a little deeper on how you do that stuff. So a texture layer, you get 3 extra texture layers, and again, just like the main layer, you can choose, hey, I want this thing triplanared, I want it projected, whatever way you want to handle the UVs. You can do stochastic as well on this layer independently. And you can also use Vertex Mask. And when you turn this on, then it's going to look at the vertex data and let you can use a vertex painter to paint where you want that texture to come through. So the red channel will control the first texture layer, the green the second, and the blue the third, right? So really easy to go in and like customize and blend between these layers that way. In this case, I'm using layer noise. And so I've turned on layer noise, and basically I can adjust the amplitude of that noise. I can change the center of it, which will basically, bias towards being all one or the other. I can change the noise offset just to get some different looks or something. And the frequency of that noise, so if I want smaller bits or bigger bits, right? And again, the type of noise is controlled by this top system up here, where you can say like, hey, I want high quality procedural noise, low quality procedural noise, or you can use texture based, where you actually give it a texture, and that becomes your noise. So I'm using noise, and in this case I'm using height blending, and I can basically like control the height of this layer. And if you notice here, as I move this, you'll see this like black ring in there. That is this layer blend tint. And the idea here is that this only shows up in the blend area. And so without it, you can see that we just get kind of, okay, it's bricks and, and plaster. And it looks pretty good, right? But with this in, you get a little more contextual information there. It makes it look a little more damaged. And it's a nice way to kind of get some extra details in there without using another layer. It's a very simple trick. You can turn on an angle height filter, but for that I'm going to go over to this moss shader here. Let's grab the moss material. And, it's warning me about some normal maps I need to fix. Let's fix those. And what we'll see here is that this layer is being alpha blended instead of height blending. So instead of like trying to make one sort of win out over the other based on its height field, it's just going to blend them with alpha blending, right? And in this case, what I have is I have an angle height, an angle minimum here. So as I raise that, you'll see it only appears really on the upward facing parts of this object, okay? And then there's this vertex to normal filter. So if I do it with vertex base, it's going to use the vertex normals to decide this. So you can see over here, it's kind of like putting it all on the top part of this thing. It's not paying attention to the world normal so much as it is, or like the surface normal, as it is the vertex normal, which is just a sphere. But if I put this over to normal, then it's going to get rid of it on these bottom sides because it's looking at that perturbed normal map normal, okay? And then the height field lets us control where in the height map texture it is. So in this case, I'm putting it only on the tops of the rocks. And I can invert that to put it on the bottom as well. So again, this is a really nice way, and you can play with the contrast here to kind of make it a sharper transition or not. But this is a really nice way to kind of do procedural texturing. And you can combine this with the noise. So you could have a big world space noise that says, okay, I'm just going to like put moss in some areas of the forest, right? And then everything in those areas, if they all have the same noise settings, are going to like have moss or not have moss on them, depending on that noise, but they'll still follow the rules of the angles and stuff that you've set up. And then the rest of this will look pretty similar. It's just another texture layer. It's got the albedo with its tiling and offset, the normal, the mask map. And if you were in fast packing mode, then this would expect to use the same packing mode. Smoothest remaps, all this stuff. You also get strength of albedo and normal so that you can adjust these independently in here. Oh, and I have it doubled here, so I'll have to fix that. This is supposed to be smoothness. So, yeah, that's a little bug. And then finally, let's go down, let's look at the tessellation parameters. So if we look at this guy here, it's currently using, we can use two types of tessellation. We can use edge-based and distance-based. So the strategy of edge-based tessellation is it tries to keep the triangle edges the same size, right? So you say, I want them 12 pixels in size, and it tries to keep triangles around that size. That's really nice for performance, but I find it tends to be a little less stable because as you move around an object like this, you know, the polygons are all changing their edge size. And so you see things kind of swim in and out. Whereas with distance resampling, if I'm going around this object, I'm basically the same distance the whole time. And so things aren't swimming in and out. They're staying equally tessellated, right? And with distance-based tessellation, you get a fade start. So 20 meters or 20 units away or 30 units away, I will start fading out tessellation, and I will have it completely faded out, including the displacement by 20 meters after that, so 50 meters. And then you can say how far you want it to be displaced. Your max subdivisions, which is how many times it will divide the original triangles. Mipbiasing, which basically controls which mipmap the texture should look at. And the advantage of this is when you have it really at 0 and you're looking at this really high-res mipmap, if you have really high-res information, it can end up like kind of jittery because it's looking at one pixel and then you move a little bit and it's looking at a different pixel now, and that pixel is like totally different, right? Because it's a really high-res image. So by going turning the Mipbias up, you look in lower mipmap levels where the texture is lower res. It also makes it faster too, which is nice. And then you can offset the center point of the tessellation to kind of keep it somewhere around where the original mesh was if you're walking on it or something like that, or need to collide with it. And then we get into the effects that are included. And right now I have a nice little selection of effects here. Let me show the snow. Oops, my texture needs fixing there too. So the snow right now is set to local mode. This means that it's going to look at these shader options instead of being driven by a system like Enviro. If we set it to global, then the settings in Enviro will control this object. What Enviro does is it sets global shader variables for what the amount of snow is. And this will just read those. And so Microsplat has been using that for ages. That's how the integration works. It's a really simple way. And in the docs, it'll show you how to call these yourself if you want to adapt them yourselves and control the snow amount. So yeah, so you can see I can turn the snow up and down. And then I have like angle fall off, right? And the contrast amount, so sort of how kind of quickly the snow falls from solid to not solid. You can set a world height range for this, so that if you want to place this in the world and snow is going to, you know, appear from 50 meters to 200 meters up, and it's going to be full volume at 200 meters up, and then everything above there is, you know, fully snowed, then it will use this to filter it. And there's also a vertex offset, which if you do really subtly and you get the, you know, the controls right, you can get to just kind of raise the object a little bit where it's snowy. This also works with tessellation if you tessellate things. And we also have some other effects in here. I'll just show off really quick. This is the puddles system. Oops, I grabbed the wrong object. I need puddles. There we go. I'm looking at the right shader here. Huh, stop drawing the puddle control for some reason. Draws it here. Well, I might not show you that today, mainly because I've got a bug in the controls, but that's why I'm still dog fooding this. Oh, here we go. Puddle mode. I think the puddle mode is off. Oh, okay. There's a little bug in there where it thinks the puddle mode is off when it's actually not. That's an easy fix. I know what I did there. But as an example here, just like the wall, I'm using a noise function to control where these puddles are. And I used world space noise so that I can move this and puddles will appear in different spots. If you wanted the puddles exactly, where they were, you could put it in local space. But again, you could set up all of your terrain. You could use an angle filter so that it doesn't appear on slopes and things and just get puddles to appear. I'll probably move this feature over to Microsplat as well because it's a pretty nice little feature. What else do we have? Wetness mode. This is probably going to do the same thing the other one did. Yeah, okay, there's the actual problem. So I will fix that. Wetness is very similar. It makes objects wet, and it has local global mode so that you can integrate with Enviro. Oh, the debug mode. So this is interesting. Okay, so if you're doing triplanar texturing, you have to sample the texture 3 times for each of the triplanar angles. Okay, if you're doing stochastic, you have to sample the texture 3 times for each of the stochastic samples that it blends together to create the non-repeating tiling pattern. Okay, so that's 9 samples. It's a lot of samples. So the shader actually culls things that aren't going to be used because the angle is too great, or the stochastic is not, only needs one of the textures in the area, like in the center of it, in center of a patch. And so the shader can actually take less samples than that. But I have a mode in here that lets us actually view how many samples the shader is taking. Okay, so when we turn this on, what we get is a threshold here. And we see the debug sample threshold is 5, which means that if we're greater than 5 shaders, then it's going to tint this thing red. Okay, so as I bring this up, there we go, you can see some blue coming in. So anything that's blue is below this number in terms of samples. And so you can see that it's managing to cull some of the stochastic samples there. And in those areas, it will take less GPU performance because it doesn't have to sample them all. Okay, you'll also find that on the layer with stochastic here, as I change that contrast, if I go really high contrast, it's actually a low value, but if I go really high contrast, you'll see that a lot more of that area doesn't need to be as many samples, which is good. And the same thing's true of triplanar. It won't show on the wall because we don't have a good surface for this, but you can basically come in here and just tweak these values and figure out, okay, that's going to make the shader a little faster. And then you can kind of come in here and really look at it and be like, am I okay with that, with that triplanar contrast where it is? Or the, in this case, it's stochastic. And in this case, it's not making much of a difference. You can see the difference here. So you can see if I go really tight, you can kind of see where the samples are, right? Where it is doing the blending. But it actually looks pretty good, pretty tight. So you can save, some performance that way. And so with this, you can look at your scene and basically figure out how much cost you're paying in actual sample counts, which is the primary bottleneck of a shader that does a lot of texture samples, and get an idea of it. So yeah, that's basically the shader. I'm still testing some stuff, tweaking some stuff, but it's pretty close at this point. It's got a lot of cool features, and I'm really excited to get this out because I think there's a lot of people trying to make URP games that have, a much higher quality look than maybe what URP was originally when there was lightweight render pipeline and it was all about super low end, right? And this shader can go up there, but it can also do really low end stuff. It can pack the textures tighter than that shader, so it can be more efficient than that shader. It can auto-generate normals in certain cases where that looks okay. And then, hey, you don't need a normal map. You can do this all with one texture map, right? Instead of 2, or instead of 5, or whatever they take for their shader. So there's a lot of advantage to this, I think, for the low end as well as on the high end. and it means that the project can scale much nicer, and you can play with all these procedural noise effects, which can speed up your world building and make objects far more reusable than they are without these techniques. So yeah, I'm pretty psyched to get this out, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video. And yeah, thanks.